Here's the deal. Rings of Power leaned way too hard on Tolkien, and that's where it all went wrong. If it had been just another fantasy series, would it really have faced this much hate? Let's break down what could have been Rings of Power's biggest mistake. Let's not sugarcoat it. Rings of Power's biggest mistake was leaning too heavily on Tolkien's legacy. Amazon spent a staggering $250 million just for the rights to the Tolkien name, and while that sounds impressive, it set the show up for failure. Instead of delivering a well-crafted original fantasy series, they leaned on the Lord of the Rings brand like a crutch, and it backfired. The show's problems were obvious from the start. Only 37% of US viewers who started Season 1 actually finished it. That's a brutal number for any series, let alone the most expensive TV show ever made. The Rotten Tomatoes audience score is about the same, hovering around 38%, which tells you everything you need to know about the general sentiment. Critics weren't much kinder, with the show failing to become the cultural phenomenon Amazon had hoped for. For all the money thrown at Rings of Power, it never reached the level of success HBO's Game of Thrones did. And here's the kicker. Game of Thrones was based on a far less well-known series of books, but it still captured audiences because it stood on its own storytelling and characters. Meanwhile, Rings of Power tried too hard to be Lord of the Rings without delivering the same magic, and the results speak for themselves. Amazon didn't just buy the rights to Tolkien's work, they bought the weight of fan expectations, and that's where things went south. By leaning so hard on the Tolkien name, Rings of Power set itself up for an impossible challenge, pleasing hardcore Tolkien purists while still trying to attract a broader audience. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Season 2 has already shown that audience interest is dwindling. About 900,000 US households tuned in for the first episode within 4 days of its premiere. That's half the size of Season 1's pilot audience. And with only 37% of viewers completing Season 1, it's clear that Rings of Power is struggling to hold attention. Despite these numbers, Season 3 is still in the works, though Amazon hasn't fully confirmed it. Showrunner Patrick McKay recently said they're cooking it, so they're not giving up just yet. Rings of Power marketed itself as the next great Lord of the Rings adaptation, which sounds amazing on paper, but in practice it just made the flaws stand out more. Whether it was the writing, pacing, or questionable CGI, fans weren't watching Rings of Power as just another fantasy show. They were watching it as a Tolkien adaptation, and in that context, it didn't measure up. Unlike Game of Thrones, which succeeded because it built its own identity, Rings of Power relied on Tolkien's legacy as a shortcut to success. But the Tolkien connection didn't hide the cracks in the show's foundation. Instead, it made them painfully obvious. Now here's the real question. What if Rings of Power wasn't tied to Tolkien at all? Imagine it as just another generic fantasy series. Would people still be dragging it as hard as they are now? Probably not. It's got its flaws, sure. The pacing is off, the CGI is hit or miss, and the writing feels like it's on autopilot sometimes. But if you strip away the Lord of the Rings branding, it's just another mid-tier fantasy show, not the laughably horrible Tolkien adaptation that critics have labeled it. Let's face it, the Rings of Power name gave it more attention than it deserved. People tuned in because it was supposed to be the next big thing in the Tolkien universe, but the actual content didn't live up to that. Without the Tolkien connection, it probably would have just faded into the background, like so many other fantasy shows that come and go. We wouldn't be talking about it as a disaster, we just wouldn't be talking about it at all. Sure, the show would still have its quality issues, but without the pressure of being compared to Lord of the Rings, maybe it wouldn't have felt like such a massive letdown. People might have seen it as just okay instead of a total disaster. The Tolkien name brought in the audience, but it also brought the harshest critiques. So, could Rings of Power have worked without leaning so heavily on Tolkien's name? Maybe, but it would have been a completely different game. Without that legendary branding, it likely wouldn't have gotten the same level of attention, nor would Amazon have dropped $1 billion on it. But on the flip side, the Tolkien connection set expectations so high that the show was doomed to disappoint a lot of people. The real issue here is the catch-22. Without the Lord of the Rings name, Rings of Power could have flown under the radar and just been another fantasy series, probably still criticized but nowhere near as viciously. With it, the show had the attention, the massive budget, and the built-in fan base, but it was never going to live up to those standards. The biggest mistake Rings of Power made was thinking it could just slap Tolkien's name on a show and have it succeed. The connection to his work may have saved it from total irrelevance, but at the cost of setting itself up for the backlash it received. It's a tricky balance, one that Rings of Power couldn't quite figure out. If you agree with me, or maybe if you think you know exactly how Rings of Power could become a successful series, share your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.